Bopping's going to start soon. Okay, and this is the point at which I didn't realize that I knew how to turn off that, whatever it is, that art project we like to call it. Hello and welcome to the HR Data Log Bag Lunch for Friday, February 21st, 2025. I'm your host, David Turetsky, alongside my best friend, co-host, partner in crime, Dwight Barry White Brown.
Hello, David. For those of you who don't know, I was the lucky winner of COVID this week.
Oh, no, not yay. No.
Yeah. It was yay all the way around. But so apologies to our audience for my scratchy voice, but you know,
I'm sure some
hopefully
people
more
will
like
enjoy
Barry
it
White.
because, yes, it's got that Barry White baritone going. And we have with us one of our other besties from salary.com, Hunter Myers. Hunter Myers, how are you?
Not too bad, David. How you doing?
Doing great now that you're here. Hunter, why don't you tell a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a senior compensation consultant at salary.com. Been here a little over 3 years, a background in talent acquisition and a receipt of an economics degree from Harvard University. So
Nice.
So as my mother would say, a real dummy.
truly.
Hunter, before we get started on the topic du jour, what's one thing you did or the last thing you did for the first time? I almost perverted Dwight back to the other one.
I know.
Well, I grew up as an athlete and I've been playing basketball all my life, but the last thing I did for the first time was actually tear 2 ankle ligaments on my 30th birthday.
That's what we call welcome to getting old.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing like jumping right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
Emphasis on jumping.
Wow.
Right.
Hunter, we've had lots of confessions on this program, and that one is truly one of the more painful ones we've heard.
Yeah.
It's not as bad as it sounds, I will say.
Okay.
I remember when it happened, and I think it was pretty bad at that point.
Yeah. Unless the adrenaline going through you at that point in time
Right.
was so much that it kind of like masked the pain.
I was just going to say it's been a long enough time that I've put it out of my mind.
Yeah, I can see that.
You're what, 31, 32?
Just turned 30 in September.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not been that long. All right. Well,
in dog years, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. My dog is snoring over there, and he's like, "Yeah, I aged 7 years in one of your human years." So, So Hunter, now that we've gotten all that out of the way, our topic for today is compensation complexities. But before we get there, the bump. Okay, that was enough. And by the way, I forgot to mention, we are sponsored by salary.com. Salary.com for your consulting, data, and technology needs around compensation and HR. So, Hunter, we're talking about compensation complexities. That world is gigantic, ginormous, especially with all of the regulation going on today. When I mentioned that to you, what was the first thing that came to your mind?
I mean, compensation is inherently complex these days. We're using so many different kinds of data to go towards so many different kinds of ends. One of the most complex projects that sticks out to me most recently was a project that we did on paid time off and sick time accruals across multiple states in the U.S., taking into account different sick time laws and different thresholds that the company needed to meet with a single PTO policy.
And oh, by the way, they were anniversary date on the reset of their PTO policy. So it wasn't like you could use an end of year as being the common date.
Yeah. And to make matters worse, for the PTO calculations, we had to leverage a legacy HRIS to pull the first 6 months of data.
No.
So that problem was interesting because they use different employee ID numbers. So we had to get a translation table developed for that.
Yeah, it was an interesting project, and that was the first experience I'd had trying to recombine two HRISs to get to a single employee point.
Yeah. I mean, of the more fun examples of being able to help a company figure out just a problem that is going on with their, well, in this case, their migration from one system to another. But wow, yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
fun is one of my choice words too.
yeah, I think one of the other things that was about that one, and I'd love your opinion on this, is it was, as you mentioned, there was a lot of state regulation, there were a lot of state laws, but also there were also some other regulations as well. But the horrible thing was we had to get whatever the right table was and actually implement that for each of the individual municipalities.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you're faced with workbooks that contain tens of thousands of rows of data, and you have to make it mean something, and you have to make it mean the right thing, and it has to be something that abides by the legislation and something that can be easily communicated to all the employees who are actually dealing with the PTO that they're accruing and taking.
Yeah. So we can call this a multivariate equation.
Quite literally.
Yeah. So that's one example. Let's talk a little bit about some of the examples that we've had to deal with recently with regard to things like pay equity. Now, we all know here at salary.com that you are the authority on pay equity and pay equity legislation when it comes to running regressions. How fun is that?
My answer may differ from a lot of people's, but I find it probably the most fun part of my job, because you are quite literally taking, as I mentioned, thousands of rows of essentially empty data that don't really correlate to one another, and you're understanding, based on all of those individual demographic points, why somebody is making a different amount of compensation than somebody else. And the goal there is to ascertain, to make sure that it's not differing by gender or ethnicity, but that it's differing on potentially more defensible figures like a department difference or, for example, geographic differentials.
And then you have to prove statistical significance if gaps are found.
Exactly.
And for those of you who don't know statistical significance, we can get a treatise from Mr. Myers on p-values, f-values, as well as what that all means.
Yeah, I don't think this podcast is a Stats 101 lecture, David.
Well, what's fascinating is we've literally had these technical conversations with clients about the F values and whether or not it's useful to look at P values or F values, or, what distribution are we looking at and why, and what's explainable in this error. And obviously you're looking at the betas, you're looking at the coefficients to see what has the highest correlation, as well as, are they negatively correlating or positively correlating to gaps and to pay.
Yeah. One of the hardest statistical measures to leverage is one that you hadn't even mentioned yet, and that's the R-squared value.
Yes.
The value that tells us overall how well that model is explaining, in this instance, pay variation. And we're never going to achieve 100%. So there's always that unexplained variance that has to be, in some instances, left up to the interpretation. Now, our benefit is, as a consultant, we're dealing with those raw figures. And when we bring those results to the client, they're, in a lot of instances, able to share some additional context that couldn't be quantified in the regression to say, oh, I know exactly why that person's making this amount because of XYZ.
Right.
And that is justification enough. And again, not dialing back on that gender or ethnic difference.
It's always interesting when we start to talk about pay equity with clients that they think it's very simple until we start to roll out the statistics that go to go with it,
Right.
and all of a sudden they're like a deer in the headlights.
Yeah.
It's you gotta it's it's doing like you talked about and being able to explain the values and what does this mean from a statistical standpoint, and
Yeah.
it gets very complex very fast, and
Well, even getting there though, Dwight, like we have to go through and make sure that the data's all there and that the values are all
right,
there. And we also have to make sure that we're breaking these groups into cohorts that make sense and
right.
have the statistical significant populations within those cohorts.
Mhm.
Um, what are they called? SSGs?
Similarly situated groups.
Right. And make sure that we can explain the differentials inside those SSGs or between SSGs.
Exactly. And the creation of those is, like you said, David, one of the more difficult aspects of this project. There is some guidance that the federal government has provided around those pay equity analyses, but when it comes to the creation of SSGs, the only guidance we have is that those divisions just have to be reasonable. They have to be completed on a reasonable basis. So if you can justify the reasonability for why these two individuals are similarly situated, that's justification enough to group them together.
It's probably a blessing and a curse that they don't tell you how to do it.
Right.
Probably both, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we've talked to a lot of companies about pay equity, and pay equity used to be probably 6 months or a year ago one of those hot topics that we were talking about all the time. Lately, we're talking about other really hot topics like pay transparency, and we're talking about compression, and companies are still going through a lot of work doing structures or creating structures and market pricing their jobs. So let's talk a little bit about some of the complexities that we get into when we're dealing with whether it's pay transparency or market pricing. I mean, again, we're all comp geeks here, so this stuff is awesome for us. But what have you seen in terms of the complexities there?
Yeah, a lot of the complexities boil down to how easy it is to administer whatever compensation philosophy or plan that you have laid out. Now, you touched on the market pricing and creation of salary structures, and all that hinges on market data. And the market data has to be reputable. The benefit we have is we have a lot of reputable survey sources that we can compile and even compare and contrast against
Mm-hmm.
to really get at the specific components of how an individual should be paid in a certain job based on so many different factors. And when you price a job, it comes down to, here at salary.com, three main factors: industry, geography, and company size. But that goes into just the creation of the ranges, and then the actual administration of the individual's own compensation begins to question, well, where do they fall within that range?
Right.
So it's two layers of complexity. It's complex in the compilation of the data, but it's secondarily complex in the actual administration of it.
And we've seen recently where markets are fluctuating so vastly,
Mm-hmm.
whether
Mhm.
it's some jobs are very hot or other jobs are seeing a lot of entrance into the market, or we're seeing people get laid off in certain areas. And while we haven't seen a lot of softness in certain sectors yet, that's certainly going to affect rates.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the world is moving at light speed, and it's hard to keep up,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with something this complex.
So what would you suggest that people do in terms of, staying on top of the complexity other than listening to HR Data Labs and the brown bag lunches?
Well, that will definitely help. But aside from just constant awareness of the market dynamics, it is kind of that repetitive market pricing. Making sure you have that continuous calibration, and that can get pricey, understandably, but it has to also fit within budget constrictions. And at the end of the day, you have to be able to pay your employees too. So it's a challenge, and I think right now there is no direct answer to it, but there's AI tools that are helping piece together some of those market data pieces that can be more readily accessible. But it's just, I mean, it all chalks down to awareness and observation.
So
So
go ahead, Dwight.
from your perspective, what are the key steps leading up to a pay equity analysis to really be able to help that analysis go smoothly?
The first thing has to do with the data that you have access to. Pay equity specifically deals with a lot of individual demographic data points.
Hmm.
So the more robust that you can compile data on your active incumbents, the more robust the pay equity results are going to be.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, there are limitations in requiring that your population declare what gender or ethnicity they become. So
Hmm.
there are certain things that we have to be aware of, but in terms of data points like time with company and the difference in that between time and job,
Hmm.
those are two linked data points, but they tell a different story. You can leverage them both in a single regression to assess the differences between internal promotion schedules and external hiring rates and what different people enter a job at in terms of a starting rate and how they've progressed over time. So
Okay.
data cleanliness is paramount in all of these facets.
Is that the biggest issue you run into as you're doing these pay equity analyses, is that you're dealing with a lot of
Usually.
dirty data in there?
Usually it's the data that becomes the issue. Like I said before, we can never explain 100% of that variance, but the
Hmm.
more data we have, the more we can explain. And the dirtier the data becomes, that just drops that overall explanatory power of the models that we build.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I
And
don't
that's
know how, if
probably
we
that
mentioned that
data.
enough. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think we mentioned it enough. The data governance aspect of things, and out of all the complexity in dealing with pay equity, in many ways, it's probably the easiest and the hardest thing to do all at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, we in HR were control of all that data. I think it would be easier. The problem is that we're not in control. We're
Right.
kind of stewards of it, but the managers and employees and executives own a lot of the decisions that go to drive that data.
Right.
And if we don't know about them on a timely basis, or the forms aren't completely filled out, or the approvals haven't happened, or somebody forgot, that
Yep.
happens a lot.
and it
Um,
can vary so much as from one manager to the next in the same organization.
yeah.
Hmm.
Well, Hunter, you were talking about it too. Sorry, Dwight. You were talking about it too before, where you said the data's got to be clean, and even having an election or having a choice that someone makes by putting in their gender. I mean,
Hmm.
that's. I mean, we know that people make decisions on that all the time, and even having that accurate in the system goes a long way to making sure that these analyses are correct.
Absolutely. And like I said, we can't require that people disclose that sort of sensitive information, but we have language to help them understand the benefit of it, because to be assessed from a pay equity perspective on the basis of gender or ethnicity, we need that data point. We can't determine whether gender or race is a factor that's leading to pay differences if we don't have that data point on the individual. We can assess other factors, but the core of a pay equity study is to assess whether or not there are any non-defensible pay discriminations occurring.
And I would imagine that the projects pretty much may very well highlight data cleanliness issues and areas where data governance probably could have helped a little bit more, especially when you start to deal with these large, complex organizations that have multiple different computer systems that are linked together in some way or another, and trying to figure out the source of truth. You know, you may have three different systems in an organization
Right.
collecting gender, ethnicity, and having the data governance to figure out which one is the source of truth. And
Yeah,
um, but that's a long, involved process. But I would imagine that even through the pay equity analysis, you're probably able to highlight some of those issues, kind of as a secondary benefit of everything.
certainly. I always like to say during those sorts of presentations, like, pay equity is ripe for ancillary findings. Our goal is to determine if pay is varied by gender or ethnicity, but we find so much more just by looking at that raw data in those regressions.
Mhm.
And this entire conversation is about just a single organization. We haven't even added the layer of complexity of potential mergers, acquisitions, when
Yeah.
you deal with those computer
Yeah.
systems that have
Right.
come from other entities, but still have to correlate together.
Yeah. Yeah, then it really gets interesting.
Well, but that also goes back to the cleanliness of the data. And many organizations are built based on not only organic growth and hiring, but through acquisition. And so having that information and insight inside of the HRIS, but also in a way that maybe that's an SSG. Maybe that is maybe that's a group, a cohort that has to be looked at together, where you're bringing a whole bunch of people together into an organization. Probably needs to be examined on its own, as well as with other cohorts of their peers in the acquiring company.
Certainly. I mean, that's one of the benefits of the methodology of multivariable regressions itself is if a point can be quantified, it can be included in the regression. So if you have, say, different origin codes for acquired companies, you can leverage that as a variable within the regression to see what actual variance in pay that contributes to.
I could geek out on this stuff all day. The other thing I want to ask you about this is the frequency of review, because what you're talking about in certain circumstances is an annual review where people make a one-time a year investment in time, investment in money to clean up and basically query what's the situation today. But every time there's a new hire, every time a merit process happens, every time bonuses are given, even overtime occurs, those kind of situations can occur. How frequently do you think people need to run pay equity analyses?
It depends on a couple factors. Now, for organizations that exist in Illinois and have more than 15 employees, they're required by the state to do it every 2 years. Other than that, it's left up to the risk tolerance of the institution, ultimately. Now, when we provide exports of final pay equity results, our recommendation is to do it annually. Now, if we go down the route of having conversations to remediate any potentially existing issues, it could be recommended to redo that in 6 months to ensure that the remediation actually solved the issue.
Right.
And then there are other organizations that we've run the study for that have come out clean from top to bottom, no instances of even a concern. And so those organizations, if they move in the same path with their existing compensation philosophy, they can likely get away with it every 2 to 5 years. But again, it's that consistent observation, maybe closer to 2 to 3 years, I should say, rather than 2 to 5. But
yeah, but
it's still a consistent requirement.
Yeah, but because this is a Rubik's Cube, you might be solving one problem, making another. Is there a recursive element to the pay equity analysis that when you're making decisions, you're going to see what those decisions, or if I guess the system that you're talking about, does it suggest alternatives, and then does it test those alternatives to see if it breaks other potential statistically significant gaps in other groups?
So your question, David, is going down the route of assuming there exists a potential problem, because those conversations...
I thought you were going to say going down a rat hole, but that's not the first time anybody's ever accused me of that. Sorry, Hunter. I didn't mean to interrupt, but...
No, but if we need to have conversations about remediation, the tools that we use recommend adjustments, but those adjustments can be manually altered. But then through that avenue, we always rerun with the potentially adjusted compensation to see, A, did it solve the problem? B, did it create a problem elsewhere?
That solves it right there. So you're saying
it is a very iterative
nature,
iterative and
nature
recursive
is taken care of then.
Certainly, yes. I mean, that's the entire intention, and that's part of the way that we set these analyses up, is that in 6 months or a year from now, leveraging the same data points, it can be reproducible with the new population.
Which is the important part. You need to make sure that anything that, whether it's hires, whether it's promotions, demotions, whatever, hasn't upset the apple cart in a way that you need to go back and make more adjustments.
Right.
I would imagine with a dynamic company, that's going to happen all the time anyways.
It seems to be trending more that way these days. It's becoming, as you mentioned earlier in this podcast, David, a lot more of a buzzword. A lot more organizations and senior leaders in organizations are being more aware of it, as well as the ramifications that trickle down to the actual employees.
Yeah, I mean, as more and more states roll this out, it's going to be at the top of mind for more and more organizations.
And to that end, what are the other things you think might be top of mind for people that's causing them to lose sleep at night, or complexities, not just in compensation, but in HR?
I mean, we've touched extensively on the data. The other complexity, I mentioned it early on, is just the administration of whatever you decide, however complex it is, it has to be administered to the population. So if you have that multinational organization with 7 different salary structures, you're still going to have to pay your people just the way a mid-sized business with a single salary structure does.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, and let's not forget the growing trend of more personalization of things like benefits for employees.
Yeah.
It's a great thing, but at the same time, it adds a whole new level of complexity
Right.
on top of everything else that's already there.
And the other aspect of complexity from an organizational perspective is the emerging trend of career progression disclosure.
Yeah. Thank you,
Yeah.
Colorado. No, I'm serious. I love the fact that Colorado did this. I think
My
it's
current
wonderful.
home state.
There you go.
Yep.
Woo-hoo.
Yeah, but we've been leveraging that a lot with job architectures and career frameworks, because that is the inherent tool to help visually display what career progressions could look like.
Now, in your state, is there a lot of talk about how useful the career progression disclosures are? Or is it kind of just another one of those things that is an HR thing that not a lot of people talk about?
I think right now it's still just an HR thing because people don't really understand the definition of it. It's to the layman person, it's yes, this job gets promoted into this job, but there's more nuance behind that in, okay, what skills are required to actually achieve that threshold to be promoted. It's not just one job going to the next, it's how and it's why.
Right.
Yeah.
Got to be honest with you. I am in awe of all of the technological things in your brain. And what I mean by that is when I was your age, God, I sound old. I guess I am old. When I was your age, the big things that we were doing were computer aided job evaluation, or we were doing, really, I guess, complete statistical models of a company's pay at the market. And so I benchmarked everybody in a company and then added it all up and said, this is what it'll take to get people to the median or to the 75th percentile. And here's how much that costs in total cash and then total reward. But a lot of the systems that you're talking about, and yes, they are from salary.com. Thank you, salary.com. But they are very thoughtful and very complex for a reason, right? Because everything we've just talked about, this is what people are doing every day. And a lot of people are still doing it very manually.
Yeah. And you mentioned it, David. People are losing sleep over it. And so the software as a tool is meant to simplify a lot of that and keeping the complex out of the direct eye. It's like the complexities are going to exist, but it's whether or not you, understand them, first and foremost, which most professionals in HR do at the moment, or I'll take your lead on that one. But
oh no, I think I think a lot of people in HR would love to really say that they understand a lot of it, but a lot of it's very complex for a lot of people. Even comp people, I don't know if hopefully people on LinkedIn correct me on this, but I don't think there are a lot of comp people that do a lot of that pay equity regression. I think that's beyond a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we as consultants have jobs. We can do it for them.
Right.
Yeah. And it's because of the complexities. And also it's not just the complexities, but it's the nuances of the legislation that drive those complexities. that if they're not right, it's
Right.
it's worse than useless.
Yeah.
It's dangerous.
Yeah. But I will say a consultant can't do it all because the client context is paramount at the end of the day as
Sure.
well.
Sure.
Right.
And we
There's
can
got to
only
be a
provide
certain level.
recommendations.
Yeah, exactly. We can only make recommendations, and there's got to be a certain level of understanding by the client.
Exactly. Well, Hunter, we're at our time. Thank you so much for being on the HR Data Labs Brown Bag Lunch.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, man.
Yep. And thank you, Dwight.
Thank you. And hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.
Yes, everybody be safe, and we will see you next Friday. Thank you, Salary.com, for sponsoring this show. Take care.